So, yeah, just to recap, last week I went over the four Gospels. So, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Went over those and discussed who wrote them, when they were written, and just kind of gave summaries of what each of those Gospels is doing. They're all a bit unique in their approach. They're kind of covering the same historical events and things, but they do it in a little bit different ways. So I went over that. And then there was a lot of fun things about, kind of hints of how we can sort of support the idea of who wrote them. And so there's a lot of little fun things there about the different authors. This week is a little bit more straightforward. So I'm going to go over Acts, Romans, and then the first and second Corinthians. Acts is the final of the first five books of the New Testament are kind of the historical books. They are just kind of giving history. So it's the four Gospels, and then Acts is kind of the historical section of just someone writing to give information about stuff that happened and things people said. So Acts is a history, and then the next three that we're going over tonight, Romans and First and Second Corinthians, introduces these letters ascribed to the Apostle Paul. So there's a good chunk of the New Testament where there are just letters from Paul. We'll get into whether these were all really letters from Paul or not. But for now, just that's the way they are ordered in the New Testament anyways. You've got these five history books, and then a big long chunk of just these letters written by a guy named Paul. And the first section of those letters from Paul are letters he wrote to churches. So lots of people in one area, lots of Christians in one area. And then the last of his letters in the New Testament, before it goes on to some other author, the last of those letters are to specific individuals. They call those pastoral letters, him just writing to one individual person. So this week we're going to introduce his letters to churches. And next week I may be able to finish all of those letters if I really go ham and do six books in 1 week. So, all right. So we'll kick it off with Acts. As I mentioned, it's a history. So it just chronicles the first 30 years of the Christian church. The Gospels are history books, and Acts is even more so. It's very historical. It really starts out, the author lays out his method and says, hey, I gathered all this stuff that people have written about these Jesus events. I've what, actually, nope, I'm confusing his. That's how Luke starts out his gospel, and then he actually continues it in Acts. He opens it up by saying, I'm going to continue that account where I gathered all these written materials and these witnesses and things like that about Jesus's life and death, and I'm continuing that account here and talking more about what happens after that. After Jesus dies, he then starts Acts with Jesus ascending to heaven, and then all this other stuff that happens in the early church. People get killed, people go around preaching, people doing miracles, and things like that. So, like I alluded to, this is written by Luke, the same guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke. Both Luke and Acts are opened exactly the same way. They're addressed to this guy named Theophilus. He says, hey, Theophilus, here's some stuff that you would be very interested in knowing. They think, maybe that this Theophilus guy is sort of Luke's patron. Back in the day, it was sort of rich, powerful guys would pay really smart guys to do research and thinking for them. And so they're thinking maybe this is kind of Luke's patron or something like that, where he's writing back to this guy who's maybe funding his journeys and things and telling him about all that's happening in this area. It opens just like the Gospel of Luke. It sounds just like him. Again, the terminology and language that's used is very consistent with a more educated person, like Luke is described as. He's a physician, he's a doctor type of guy, and so it's a bit of a higher language there. And the main reason for ascribing it to Luke is it's just unanimous. All, scholars and historians, and no one really doubts it. From, you get people starting to talk about this gospel, or sorry, not this gospel, but this book. Um, Once people start talking about an author of this book, um, they're only mentioning Luke as the author. No one ever ascribes it to anyone else. So it's just kind of unanimous through history. Um, and a kind of fun tidbit about the authorship. So this book was written very likely during Paul's house arrest in Rome. That would be kind of just a logical place for this to have been written. There's a lot of, downtime. They're not out at sea. If you read the book, there's a lot of kind of wild adventures where they're sailing the sea, and then they're trudging through different places, and they're getting run out of run out of town by people. And then Paul gets arrested in Rome, and it's a fairly peaceful, I mean, other than the fact that he's kind of in prison, it's sort of a house arrest um, type situation where they're just now hunkered down for a couple of years. And that's where Luke wrote this history, this Acts. He sat down and said, I better write all this stuff that happened. Um, and um, so the letters that Paul writes while he's on house arrest in Rome um, indicate that Luke is the only one here with me. And so that's kind of one of those hints where we think, well, this history was, anonymously written. How is tradition just randomly describing, authorship to this guy named Luke? It's these, first of all, primarily it's that unanimous consent of history, right? The fact that everyone from the 2nd century on, so we're talking the 100s, all the way till now, says it was Luke. There's no one else, it could have been. So we've got people just telling us who would have known the info, especially very early on. That's primary, but those fun little hints and things that fit is when you look at and you see, oh yeah, when Paul was writing his letters to other churches while he was on house arrest, he's saying, yeah, the only guy here is Luke. He just kind of mentions it, something like, pray for me and my only companion right now, who's Luke. And so that's how we kind of put that together and go, well, okay, that makes sense. That was probably Luke sitting there writing this book. It would have been written, as far as the dating of this book, sometime between 61 and 66. Could have been a little bit earlier. I think some people, when I did the research, thought maybe a bit earlier, but for the purposes of this study, I'm keeping it pretty general. So sometime in the early 60s, early to mid 60s is when this thing is written. The really big reason for that is that this book ends when Paul's on house arrest in Rome. It just kind of ends. It says, well, then he got arrested and hung out and taught and things like that, and then it ends. But as I mentioned in the last week, with kind of dating the Gospels and things, a big point in just history, outside of all this, a big point in history is when Paul's killed, he's martyred. In about 66 or thereabouts, mid to late 60s, Paul is very likely brutally killed in the persecutions of Nero. And that's not included in this history that Luke writes. And he writes about martyrs. He's very interested in those types of events, and he doesn't at all include that in his history. So that's probably the biggest clue that this had to have been written prior to Paul being killed. It just ends, whereas there's no way he would have left that out if it was written after Paul's death. Another little hint about the dating is it's pretty favorable towards Rome. And again, like I mentioned last week, Rome gets kind of nasty towards Christianity in the late 60s, and it gets ramped up, late 60s up until the late 90s, where it just really gets ramped through those couple of decades. So it would be kind of odd, the sort of favorable attitude in this book for it to have been written into the late 60s and later. So That's Acts. And that ends the history section of the New Testament. So we'll move on to Paul's letters. So the very next book of the New Testament, if you finish Acts, you turn next, you'll see something titled Romans. Some translations may say the Apostle Paul's letter to the Roman church, or Paul to the Romans, something like that. A lot of versions just simply say Romans. So this is a letter to the Roman church. And an epistle is another word. Instead of letter, the word epistle is used for kind of spiritual letters written to teach people about religion and spirituality, to teach and to command. There can be epistles in other religions. So a Muslim epistle would be, let me tell you about Allah and let me tell you how to be a good Muslim. That's kind of an epistle. There's a lot of variety in that genre, if you will, of epistle. So it could be as simple as, hey church, how's it going? Hope everyone's okay. Keep on keeping on. I'll see you in a year when I come visit. It could be that, or it could be very much like a sermon or a Bible study. I'm writing you guys to really teach you some truths. So there's a lot of range within epistle, and Romans is definitely more of the latter. It's a very theological, systematic letter. He's really teaching the Romans something. It's not so personal. He's really writing to them to teach them something. And the first huge chunk of Romans, I believe it's the first 8 chapters. It's a big chunk where I've mentioned this in the past to people. I think it's maybe the most important section of the Bible, because what he does is he gives a systematic presentation of salvation, of how an individual gets saved, what this sort of statement of the gospel is. People hear the word gospel, and that was the words someone used when I did my research. Is they said, this is his statement of the gospel. This is his presentation of how people get saved. And he goes on and on and on for 8 chapters. It's beautiful. It's beautiful stuff. And so that's great. And then the next section, he talks about the destiny of Israel. And for people totally unfamiliar with the history of the Bible and the history of the nation of Israel, it's might be a bit difficult to convey in simple terms. But basically, after this big long presentation of, wow, Jesus came and did all this stuff, and how do we get saved based on that? After he presents that, the natural thing is for people to wonder, this Christianity is coming out of Judaism. People go, well, what about the Jews? The Jews are they were supposed to be kind of this special people to God. Now it seems like this is really kind of, everyone can kind of come to God now. What was up with the Jews being special to God? Are they still special? And that's kind of the question of the next few chapters is, are the Jews still special? Are they still special to God in some way? Does God still have a plan for them? It's kind of the next section. And then he just sort of ends it with some practical obligations for Christian life, just some nice little commands and things like that on how to live, and closes it. He closes many of these letters in the New Testament are closed with just some almost kind of boring, things like, hey, prepare this and that for me, and I'll be here on this date, and say hi to Jim and Bob, and Gary and Steve back here where I'm at, say hi to you guys. And so he kind of ends that way. So it's a really great book. And so it was ascribed to Paul, like I said, and this is another one of those where it is not at all disputed that this was written by Paul. There's, I looked up, 7, 8, some different resources, and it's just, it's absolutely written by Paul. Unlike the first 5 books of the New Testament, the histories, these letters by Paul, they are not anonymously written. Uh, Letters most often, um, in the New Testament anyway, are usually authored like at the beginning somewhere. It says, "I, Paul, am writing to you, Romans." And so he says, "This is me, Paul, writing." Um, so it's not disputed. Everyone knows this was written by Paul. It was written out in the open, so a forgery would be detected. And kind of something fun to keep in mind for a lot of these is, but especially this, is forgery is contrary to its character. So when you're writing something that is so in love with truth and with righteousness and things like that, um, forgery doesn't really fit the message. Forgery might fit with maybe some more kind of mystical type writings of, let me kind of speak of these ethereal truths and we'll all kind of think it out for ourselves. And, it doesn't really matter if it's really Paul writing it or if it's me just kind of in imbuing the essence of Paul. So I'll just kind of sign it as Paul. That would fit with that type of writing, but this is not that type of writing. It's very objective truth and just love for truth and kind of doing things the right way, and sort of God is seeing things that we are doing, and we want to respect that and just live in truth for the glory of God. And you just can't write that type of stuff and
Right.
then sign it as someone different. You just can't. So that's just kind of a fun thing to think about. It's not proof or anything like that, but it's good little tidbit. So this thing was written probably 54 to 58 is what they say. And this is based on his travel timeline. If we go back to Acts, the cool thing is, so Acts is this timeline, it's this history, and we traveled here and there and to this place, and then we went to this place next. And Paul's involved in a lot of that, especially the second half of Acts. There's a lot of Paul and where he went and when he went, and so much of that matches Romans. Paul writes in Romans, well, I'm going to come visit you guys after I go visit such and such place. And what does Acts say? We went to visit the Romans after we went to such and such place. So they match, which is cool. And people can, parse all of that out and say, okay, well, he said, and he spent so many years here and there. And so based on all of that, he would have written it about 54 to 55. Just a fun note I thought about Romans is, so this letter to the Romans was written while Paul was in Corinth. So we're going to go to the Corinthian letters next. So he wrote letters to Corinthians while he was somewhere else, but while he's at Corinth, he's writing to Rome. And when he's writing to the Romans from Corinth, he says, "Hey, Romans, all these guys that are here with me in Corinth, they say hi." And he lists a few different people. Um, and so many of those names are Latin names, which fits with the fact that Corinth was this Roman colony. It's a very Roman, it's not like some of these other places where there's, maybe lots of Jews or people from other backgrounds. There's a lot of people from Rome here at Corinth because it's a Roman colony, and all these names sound very Roman, and so it's kind of one of those things that puts a little more like flesh on the fact that all this stuff was kind of happening in history. And um, so often, New Testament books get treated like they're not history, like they're not just letters, written by people and about real people. There's real people involved here, so it's kind of cool to see some of those correlations. So that's Romans, very cool book. We will rock on to First Corinthians, which we just talked a lot about in Bible study. So I was very familiar with First Corinthians doing this study. So First Corinthians is kind of known for being Paul's verbal beatdown on a church. He really lays into this this Corinthian church for many chapters and just tears into them for being a church of strife, for having divisions among themselves. And I think he even says something like they're notoriously immoral, this church. He is not happy with them. And so he really lays into them for quite a few chapters, and then he softens it up a little where he's answering their questions. They must have asked him questions in the past about something, and he's getting to those questions. They're sort of ethical questions. There's questions about church function, and so he kind of addresses some of those. And then importantly, there's a chapter in there that we really focused on in Bible study here a few weeks ago. There's an important chapter in there where he does get kind of theological. This isn't overall a very theological letter. It's a little bit more on that personal end, but for a chapter there, he talks about the resurrection of the dead. And he gives a very systematic presentation of the fact that the final destination of man is to come back to life. So he's fighting. It's kind of in line with him really laying into this church, because they're seem to be teaching something very contrary. And he's like, I'm going to set you straight about the resurrection of the dead. And here's what's going to happen to all of us, at the end of time. We're all coming back to life. There's no, floating up in heaven and la-di-da. We're going to be raised in the flesh to meet our maker, just like we are, new bodies, but physical. And that's happening. And so that's important to know that is in there if you're ever interested in that subject. It's 1 Corinthians, probably the place to go. So I mentioned is ascribed to Paul. And again, the unanimous testimony of history says this is Paul. I mean, he signs it Paul. It sounds just like Paul. One of the really cool tidbits that I learned when I was studying this letter is there's a guy just after the New Testament. This guy almost got included in the New Testament. Clement of Rome in the late 90s is writing things, and very great stuff. You can read his letters and they're great. Not included as scripture, but some really wonderful stuff. When we're talking late 90s, so it's an apostle. We talked last week, the Apostle John is still kicking. So apostles are still around, and certainly people who knew apostles are still around. In this late 90s time when this Clement guy is writing, he writes a letter, which we still have. He writes a letter to the Corinthians, and I think he's kind of laying into them also and saying, don't you have that letter from Paul sitting around there? Go grab that letter. I know you guys have it. You're probably reading it, every other Sunday. Paul wrote some really important stuff to you guys, and you seem like you're erring from that right now. And this is in the 90s, the late 90s. And so that's like, wow. I mean, just such a historical picture of like, this guy's not even in the New Testament, but he's verifying that, yep, the Apostle Paul, he wrote stuff to you. And so it's just Paul who wrote this stuff. And like I mentioned, the genre is, epistle, a little bit more on the sort of personal side, because he's sort of taking specific issue with some of the things that specific church is doing. So, not all churches today need to read that and go, gosh, we better get our act together. It's like, well, maybe if some of this stuff applies, but he was really specifically ticked at that time with the Corinthian church. The dating of this letter, sometime in the 50s, 50 to 57, is kind of the consensus I got in my study there. And the reasoning for that, again, is just the chronology of his travels, just kind of depending on where he was at. We know kind of where he was when he was writing to certain churches, and so you match that with the timeline that we know of his travels, and you can get a pretty good idea of when he wrote. A fun note about 1 Corinthians is it's actually not the first letter to the Corinthians. We don't have the first letter to the Corinthians, but in this book of the New Testament that we call First Corinthians, Paul references a previous letter that he had written to the church. And we don't have that for whatever reason. Maybe it was just a very, very specific letter to where it would have really no utility to anyone outside of that church during that time. We don't know, but we know we don't have it. So just kind of a fun tidbit. So Second Corinthians, um, Second Corinthians against to the same church. It's ascribed to Paul, and he's writing to the Corinthian church. And in this letter, total change of tone. He's saying, "Thank you guys for changing your ways. I really reamed into you, and you've changed, and I appreciate that." And it's almost I was kind of joking with my mentor about that this morning. Is he's almost so wrapped up in joy at their change of heart that to me it almost seems like he's kind of rambling and reminiscing and just being so caught up in the joy that he's just kind of sputtering all this great stuff about the Christian life and kind of going to this subject and that, and just he's just so filled with joy. I think the primary purpose of writing this was just say, I'm glad you guys changed your ways.
Yeah.
He does in the last three chapters, he changes his tone a little bit and says, now there are some that are still really doubting me specifically as Paul the Apostle. He's saying, um, uh, you know, you guys aren't believing me for some reason, that maybe you don't think I've got the credence to be telling you what to do or how to live or to be teaching you. And so for three chapters, he really gives a defense of, here's why you should listen to me. And it's kind of this fun, he really wrestles with, he's like, I'm nothing, but at the same time, I'm something to be listened to. He's really wrestling with this like humility of like, he calls himself, the least of the apostles. He's the last one to sort of join the band of Christian apostles. And he persecuted Christians. He was killing Christians, and he wasn't a good guy. So he's like, I'm not saying I'm anything special, but I have authority to be teaching you guys these major, major truths. And so he kind of gives that defense for three chapters there at the end. And so as far as authorship, it is ascribed to Paul. He signs it as Paul. And again, just all the, excuse me, all the historical testimony we have says, yep, this is Paul, sounds just like Paul. So that's who we reasonably take it to be written by. And then the dating, again, obviously after First Corinthians, sometime in the 50s, 52 to 58 is kind of the time frame I found. And again, that time frame is based on his travels and where he was when he was writing this. And a little fun note, so some people think this was maybe actually the fourth letter to the Corinthians. Some people think there was a letter between the first and the second. I am not so convinced of that. There was definitely a letter prior to the First Corinthians letter. The one in between is not so certain. It's basically depends on whether you think the first letter was harsh enough to match what he says in Second Corinthians about his prior letter, which I think First Corinthians was plenty harsh. And I think it totally matches the letter he's referring to in Second Corinthians as kind of that harsh letter that sort of roused them to change. But maybe he did, and that's all right if he did. So that's all I got. That's the next four books of the New Testament. A little